On the night of October 8, 1871, a fire started in a barn behind 137 DeKoven Street on the southwest side of Chicago. Within 3 hours, the fire had jumped the south branch of the Chicago River. By dawn, it had consumed the entire business district. By the time it finally burned itself out on the morning of October 10th, the fire had destroyed roughly 3.3 square miles of the most densely built city in America. 17,000 buildings turned to ash. 100,000 people, 1/3 of Chicago's entire population, were suddenly homeless. The property damage was estimated at $200 million in 1871 dollars. That is roughly $5 billion today. 300 people were confirmed dead, though the actual number was almost certainly higher because many of the victims were immigrants living in unregistered boarding houses whose names were never recorded and whose bodies were never found. And here is the part that gets left out of every history book that treats the Great Chicago Fire as a tragedy. The fire did not destroy Chicago. The fire made Chicago. What rose from those ashes in the next 30 years was something the world had never seen before. A city that invented the skyscraper, reversed the flow of its own river, hosted a World's Fair that redefined American architecture, and turned itself into the railroad capital of the entire planet. The fire was the worst thing that ever happened to Chicago, and it was the best. To understand why the fire was so catastrophic, you have to understand what Chicago was before the fire. And what Chicago was before the fire was a city made almost entirely of wood. Chicago had not even existed in any meaningful sense 40 years earlier. In the 1790s, the site was a swampy trading post near the mouth of the Chicago River, home to a handful of fur traders and a small military garrison called Fort Dearborn. The fort was built in 1803, attacked and burned by a Potawatomi force allied with the British during the War of 1812, rebuilt, and eventually abandoned as the frontier moved west. The name Chicago is believed to derive from the Potawatomi or Miami word Chicaaqua, meaning wild garlic or wild onion, a reference to the pungent plants that grew in the marshy lowlands along the river. The city was incorporated in 1837 when it had a population of roughly 4,000. It sat on the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan at the junction of the Chicago River and the Illinois and Michigan Canal, a position that made it the natural transfer point between the Great Lakes shipping routes and the river systems that connected to the Mississippi. The railroad arrived in 1848. By 1856, Chicago was the largest railroad hub in the world, with 10 trunk lines converging on the city. The population doubled and doubled again. By 1871, it had reached 300,000. The grain trade alone was staggering. Chicago's Board of Trade, established in 1848, invented the futures contract, a financial instrument that allowed grain to be bought and sold before it was even harvested. The grain elevators along the river, massive wooden structures that stored and sorted wheat, corn, and oats, were the physical infrastructure of a financial revolution that would eventually evolve into the commodity trading system used worldwide. By the late 1860s, Chicago was processing more grain than any city in the world. It was also processing more lumber, more livestock, and more manufactured goods than any city between the coasts. The growth was so fast that there was no time to build with anything but what was cheapest and most available. And what was cheapest and most available in the 1860s, Midwest, was pine lumber from the forests of Wisconsin and Michigan. The houses were wood. The sidewalks were wood. The streets were paved with wooden blocks. The bridges over the river were wood. Even many of the so-called fireproof buildings had wooden cornices, wooden window frames, and tar roofs. The lumber itself was stored in enormous yards along the river, thousands of board feet stacked in the open air. The entire city was, in the words of one contemporary observer, a fire waiting to happen. The summer and fall of 1871 had been abnormally dry. Between July and October, Chicago received roughly 1 inch of rain, a fraction of the normal amount. The wooden buildings, the wooden sidewalks, the wooden fences, all of it was bone dry. In the week before the Great Fire, there had already been 20 fires in the city. On Saturday, October 7th, a fire destroyed 4 square blocks on the west side, and the firefighters who battled it worked through the night and into the next day. They were exhausted, their equipment was damaged, and their horses were spent. When the alarm came in from the DeKoven Street barn on Sunday evening, the fire department was already operating at a fraction of its capacity. The fire department itself was a problem. Chicago had roughly 185 firefighters to protect a city of 300,000 people spread across 36 square miles. The equipment was horse-drawn. The alarm system was a network of fire alarm boxes scattered across the city, each connected by telegraph wire to the courthouse tower, where a watchman would spot the location and dispatch engines. The system was ingenious in theory and fragile in practice. If the watchman misjudged the location, or if the wires were damaged, or if the alarm box was too far from the fire, the response was delayed by minutes that, in a city of dry wood, could mean the difference between a kitchen fire and a citywide catastrophe. The firefighters themselves were experienced and brave. Many of them had fought the previous night's fire, a 4-block blaze that had exhausted both men and horses. They were starting Sunday evening already tired, already short on equipment, and about to face a fire that would make the previous night's disaster look like a campfire. The cause of the fire has never been determined with certainty. The legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the story that Catherine O'Leary was milking her cow in the barn and the cow kicked over a lantern, was first reported by a newspaper correspondent named Michael Ahern, who later admitted he had made the whole thing up. Catherine O'Leary herself was a real person, an Irish immigrant who kept 5 cows and sold milk to her neighbors. She was home on the night of the fire. The fire did start in or near her barn. But whether it was caused by a cow, a lamp, a careless neighbor, or spontaneous combustion in a pile of hay has never been established. What is established is that Mrs. O'Leary, who was innocent of everything except the misfortune of owning the barn where the fire started, was blamed for the destruction of a city and spent the rest of her life in a shame so complete that she refused to speak about the fire to anyone. In 1997, 126 years after the fact, the Chicago City Council passed a resolution officially exonerating her. She had been dead for 102 years. The fire's spread was accelerated by a series of errors and accidents that compounded on each other with the logic of a nightmare. A watchman in the courthouse tower spotted the flames but misjudged the location, sending the first engine company to the wrong address. By the time the error was corrected, the fire had a head start of roughly 30 minutes. The southwest wind, which had been blowing steadily all day, pushed the flames northeast toward the densest part of the city. Burning embers carried by the wind landed on rooftops blocks ahead of the main fire, igniting new blazes faster than the firefighters could respond. The wooden sidewalks acted as fuses, carrying fire from building to building beneath the feet of the people trying to flee. The fire reached the south branch of the Chicago River around midnight and crossed it in multiple places, leaping the water on burning debris and wind-carried sparks. The bridges, which were made of wood, caught fire themselves. On the north side of the river, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad's coal yard ignited, sending a column of flame and heat so intense that it created its own weather, a fire tornado that spun burning debris hundreds of feet into the air. The Waterworks, a Gothic limestone building on the north side that housed the city's water pumping station, survived the fire because it was made of stone, but the wooden roof of the adjacent pumping station caught fire, and the machinery inside was destroyed. The city's water supply was cut off. Without water pressure, the fire hydrants were useless. The firefighters were fighting a burning city with no water. They fell back and fell back again. By dawn on Monday, the fire had reached Lincoln Park on the north side and was burning along the lake shore. Families huddled on the beaches, some wading into the lake to escape the heat, watching the city burn behind them. The fire burned through Monday and into Tuesday morning, when a light rain began to fall. It was not the rain that stopped the fire. The fire had simply run out of city to burn. The entire area from DeKoven Street on the south to Fullerton Avenue on the north, and from the lake to the river, was gone. The fireproof buildings, the ones advertised as being safe from flames, had burned just as completely as the wooden ones. The iron frames melted. The stone facades cracked and crumbled in the heat. The contents of fireproof safes, which dozens of businessmen had trusted with their records and cash, were found to be ash when the safes were opened. The word fireproof was, in the context of the Great Chicago Fire, a sales pitch, not a fact. The human toll of the fire went beyond the count of the dead. The 100,000 people who were made homeless represented roughly every third person in Chicago. They had escaped with whatever they could carry. Some had loaded belongings onto wagons and pushed them through streets that were already on fire. Some had buried silver and jewelry in their yards, hoping to retrieve it later, and found when they returned that the heat had melted the coins into lumps. The refugees gathered in parks, in open fields, on the prairie west of the city. Lincoln Park became a tent city overnight. Makeshift shelters appeared along the lakeshore, built from charred lumber and salvaged doors. The weather turned cold within days of the fire, and the refugees, many of them without adequate clothing, faced the prospect of a Chicago winter with no shelter. The city's churches, most of which had survived because they were outside the burn zone, opened their doors. The relief effort was organized with a speed that reflected Chicago's character, brash, improvisational, and unapologetically commercial. Within a week, a general relief committee was established, chaired by some of the city's wealthiest men, and it began distributing food, clothing, and temporary housing with an efficiency that impressed even the city's critics. The insurance industry nearly collapsed under the weight of the claims. Of the roughly $200 million in property losses, only $88 million was covered by insurance. More than 60 insurance companies went bankrupt trying to pay the claims. Others paid partial settlements, 50 cents on the dollar, 25 cents on the dollar, and told their policyholders to take what was offered or sue. The policyholders sued. The lawsuits dragged through the courts for years. The fire fundamentally restructured the American insurance industry, leading to new regulations on reserves, new requirements for geographic diversification of risk, and a general understanding that a single catastrophe could destroy not just a city, but an entire sector of the financial system. The response was immediate and extraordinary. Within 48 hours of the fire's end, the first temporary structures were being erected on the still warm ruins. The Chicago Tribune, which had lost its building and its presses in the fire, was publishing again within 2 days, using borrowed equipment. The newspaper's first post-fire editorial was a single sentence that became the city's unofficial motto: "Chicago shall rise again." Donations poured in from across the country and around the world. The total relief fund exceeded $5 million, an enormous sum in 1871. Queen Victoria of England sent books to replace the libraries that had been destroyed. Other cities sent food, clothing, and building materials. The generosity was genuine, but it was also strategic. Chicago was the railroad hub that connected the agricultural interior of the continent to the markets of the East. If Chicago did not rebuild, the entire national economy would suffer. The railroads, the banks, the insurance companies, the grain exchanges, everyone who depended on Chicago had a financial interest in its survival. The rebuilding began with an argument that would determine the future of the city and, eventually, the future of urban architecture worldwide. The old Chicago had been built of wood because wood was cheap and available. The new Chicago would be built of what? Brick and stone were obvious choices, and the city council quickly passed ordinances banning wood construction in the Central District. But brick and stone buildings were heavy, expensive, and limited in height. The underlying soil of Chicago, a flat plain of clay and sand deposited by glacial meltwater, could not support the weight of tall masonry structures without foundations that were prohibitively expensive to dig. The solution came from a group of architects and engineers who invented a new type of building, one that used a steel or iron frame to carry the weight of the structure and hung non-structural curtain walls of brick, stone, or terracotta on the outside. The frame, not the walls, held the building up. This meant the walls could be thinner. The windows could be larger, and the buildings could be taller than anything that had been built before. William LeBaron Jenney, a former Civil War engineer who had studied at the École Centrale in Paris, designed the home insurance building at the corner of LaSalle and Adams Streets. Completed in 1885, it was 10 stories tall and used an iron and steel frame to support its weight. It is generally considered the first skyscraper, though the claim is debated by architectural historians who define the term differently. What is not debated is that the home insurance building demonstrated a structural principle that would transform cities around the world: the steel-framed tall building. The firm of Burnham and Root followed with the Montauk Building, the Rookery, and the Monadnock Building. Louis Sullivan, who had arrived in Chicago as a young man and studied briefly at MIT and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designed buildings that combined structural innovation with ornamental beauty, covering the steel frames in intricate terracotta decoration that made industrial construction look like art. His partner, Dankmar Adler, provided the engineering expertise. Together, they designed the Auditorium Building, a 17-story combination hotel, office building, and theater that opened in 1889 and contained one of the finest acoustical spaces in America. Sullivan articulated the philosophy that would define the Chicago School of Architecture: form follows function. The shape of a building should express what the building does, not imitate the forms of ancient temples or medieval castles. A skyscraper should look like a skyscraper, not like a Roman column stretched to 10 stories. Sullivan's most gifted student was a young draftsman from Wisconsin named Frank Lloyd Wright, who worked in the Adler and Sullivan office from 1888 to 1893. Wright absorbed Sullivan's principles, rejected Sullivan's ornament, and went on to become the most influential American architect of the 20th century. But his work would take him to the suburbs and the prairies, not to the skyscrapers of the Loop. The Loop itself, the elevated railroad that circled the downtown business district, was completed in 1897 and gave the Central District its name. The L, as Chicagoans call it, defined the geography of the city center as precisely as if someone had drawn a line on a map. Inside the Loop was business. Outside the Loop was everything else. The building code debate that followed the fire was not a polite discussion among architects. It was a class war. The ordinance banning wood construction in the central business district was broadly supported, but when the city council attempted to extend the fireproof zone to working-class neighborhoods on the north and west sides, the residents rebelled. German and Scandinavian immigrants who had lost their homes in the fire could not afford to rebuild in brick. Wood was what they knew, what they could work with, and what they could pay for. A brick house cost 3 to 4 times what a wood frame house cost. The immigrants organized, marched on City Hall, and forced the council to limit the fireproof zone to the commercial core. The result was a city divided by material, a stone and steel center surrounded by a ring of wood frame houses that would, in their turn, be replaced by the brick bungalow belt that became Chicago's most characteristic residential architecture. The Chicago bungalow, a single-story brick house with a full basement and a front porch, was built by the tens of thousands in the early 20th century. Roughly 80,000 of them still stand. They were the architectural answer to the fire: practical, fireproof, and affordable. And they gave Chicago's working-class neighborhoods a visual uniformity that no other American city shares. The world's Columbian Exposition of 1893, held on 600 acres of reclaimed swampland on the south side of Chicago along the shore of Lake Michigan, was the most ambitious public event in American history up to that time. It celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, a year late because construction took longer than expected. The chief architect was Daniel Burnham, who assembled a team of the most prominent architects in the country and directed them to build a temporary city of classical buildings, white-painted plaster over steel frames, that would showcase American industrial and cultural achievement to the world. The result was called the White City. It covered 600 acres, contained 200 buildings, featured the world's first Ferris wheel, designed by George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr., standing 264 feet tall, with 36 cars that each held 60 people, and attracted 27 million visitors over 6 months, roughly half the population of the United States at the time. The White City was a fantasy, a vision of what a city could look like if money and taste were unlimited and poverty were invisible. The buildings were temporary and were demolished after the fair, but the vision persisted. Burnham later authored the Plan of Chicago of 1909, a comprehensive urban plan that proposed lakefront parks, wide boulevards, and a civic center that would make Chicago the most beautiful city in America. Much of the plan was implemented. Grant Park, Michigan Avenue, the lakefront parks that run for miles along the shore, all of them trace their origins to Burnham's vision. The city that the fire destroyed had been wooden and accidental. The city that Burnham imagined would be steel, planned, and permanent. The reversal of the Chicago River was an engineering feat so audacious that it is still studied in civil engineering courses a century later. The problem was simple and disgusting. Chicago dumped its sewage into the Chicago River, which flowed into Lake Michigan, which was also the city's source of drinking water. The result was predictable. Typhoid and cholera epidemics swept through the city with lethal regularity. The epidemic of 1885 killed roughly 12% of the population. The solution, proposed by engineers who had apparently decided that moving a river was easier than building a sewer system, was to reverse the flow of the Chicago River so that it carried the city's sewage away from the lake and toward the Mississippi River basin. The Sanitary and Ship Canal, completed on January 2, 1900, did exactly that. It was 28 miles long, 24 feet deep, and required the excavation of more earth than the construction of the Panama Canal. When the canal opened and the river began flowing backward, the city of St. Louis, which was downstream on the Mississippi, sued Chicago for sending its sewage in their direction. Chicago won the lawsuit. The city's motto should have been changed to "We reversed a river and made it someone else's problem." It was not, but the sentiment was accurate. The city that the fire rebuilt was not just taller, it was deeper. Chicago's fundamental engineering problem was water. The city sat on a flat, marshy plain, only a few feet above the level of Lake Michigan. The streets flooded after every rain. The basements were permanently wet. Sewage pooled in the streets because there was not enough grade to drain it. In the 1850s, before the fire, the city had adopted one of the most extraordinary solutions in the history of urban engineering. It raised itself. Buildings, streets, and sidewalks were lifted on jacksacks, sometimes 6 to 8 feet, to create enough elevation for a drainage system underneath. The operation was performed block by block. A building would be jacked up, new foundations built beneath it, and the building lowered onto the new base. In one famous instance in 1860, a half block of buildings on Lake Street, including the Tremont Hotel, a 4-story brick structure weighing 22,000 tons, was raised 6 feet by a team of 600 men turning 6,000 jack screws simultaneously, while the hotel remained open and its guests went about their business. The guests had dinner in the dining room while the building rose beneath them. The raising of Chicago is one of the most underappreciated engineering achievements in American history, but it solved only half the problem. The drainage worked, but the sewage still went into the river, and the river still went into the lake. The decades after the fire saw Chicago become the industrial engine of the American interior. The mail-order industry, pioneered by Montgomery Ward and Sears, Roebuck and Company, was a Chicago invention that transformed American consumer culture. Montgomery Ward began as a single-page price list in 1872, 1 year after the fire, and grew into a catalog that was, for millions of rural Americans, the only connection to the manufactured goods of the industrial economy. Sears, which was founded in 1893, built the largest mail-order operation in the world. Its catalog, which exceeded 1,000 pages by the early 1900s, was called the Wish Book in rural households and the Consumer's Bible by the company's competitors. You could order a house from the Sears catalog, a complete kit of pre-cut lumber, hardware, and instructions, shipped by railroad, for between $600 and $5,000. roughly 70,000 Sears kit homes were sold between 1908 and 1940. Many of them are still standing. The mail order business needed railroads to deliver and a central location to ship from. Chicago had both. The Union Stockyards, which had opened in 1865, grew into the largest livestock processing complex in the world. At their peak, the yards handled 18 million animals per year. The meatpacking industry, dominated by firms like Armour, Swift, and Morris, employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, in conditions that Upton Sinclair described in The Jungle, published in 1906. Sinclair had intended the novel to expose the exploitation of workers. Instead, the public was horrified by his descriptions of what went into the sausages. The book led directly to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Sinclair later said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." The steel mills along the southern lakeshore in neighborhoods like South Chicago, Gary, and Hammond produced the structural steel that built the skyscrapers the city had invented. The Pullman Company built an entire company town south of the city, with worker housing, churches, and a hotel, all owned by George Pullman and all designed to demonstrate that enlightened capitalism could produce a docile and productive workforce. The Pullman Strike of 1894, in which workers rebelled against wage cuts imposed during a recession while rents in the company town remained unchanged, shut down railroad traffic across the country and was broken by federal troops. Eugene V. Debs, the union leader who organized the strike, was arrested and imprisoned. He emerged from prison a socialist. The American labor movement, like the American skyscraper, was largely a Chicago invention. Prohibition in the 1920s transformed Chicago into the most lawless city in America, and the lawlessness was not a malfunction of the system, but a feature of it. The Volstead Act, which banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, created an instant black market that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Chicago, with its railroad connections, its lake access, and its tradition of political corruption, was the perfect distribution hub. Al Capone, who had arrived in Chicago from Brooklyn in 1919 as a low-level enforcer, rose through the ranks of organized crime with a combination of business acumen and casual brutality that made him the most famous criminal in American history. By the mid-1920s, Capone controlled a bootlegging empire that generated an estimated $60 million a year, roughly $1 billion in today's money. He owned or controlled speakeasies, breweries, distilleries, gambling houses, and brothels. He maintained a suite at the Lexington Hotel on Michigan Avenue and cultivated a public image as a civic benefactor, opening soup kitchens during the Depression and giving interviews to reporters who treated him like a celebrity. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, in which 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a wall in a North Clark Street garage and machine-gunned by men dressed as police officers, was never officially solved, but it was universally attributed to Capone's organization. It was not the violence that was remarkable. Violence was routine. What was remarkable was the efficiency and the theatricality, qualities that Chicago had always valued in its public figures. Capone was eventually convicted not of murder, but of tax evasion in 1931 and sent to federal prison. The conviction was obtained by a team of investigators led by Elliot Ness, whose role has been significantly exaggerated by Hollywood. The real work was done by a tax accountant named Frank Wilson, who traced Capone's income through his spending. The lesson was characteristically Chicagoan. The law could not stop the killing, but it could follow the money. The Great Depression hit Chicago with particular severity because the city's economy was built on industrial production that had no buyers. The stockyards slowed. The steel mills banked their furnaces. The construction industry, which had been booming through the 1920s, stopped. Unemployment reached 50% in some neighborhoods. The relief system, which had relied on private charity and ward-level patronage, was overwhelmed. The Century of Progress International Exposition, Chicago's Second World's Fair, opened in 1933 on the lakefront, a deliberate attempt to replicate the economic boost of the 1893 fair. It drew 48 million visitors over 2 years and featured exhibits on science, technology, and the future. Sally Rand, a fan dancer whose performance at the fair combined artistry, nudity, and showmanship in proportions that the organizers had not anticipated, became the fair's most popular attraction. She was arrested 4 times. The charges were dropped each time. The fair closed with a modest profit and left behind a lakefront that would eventually become the site of some of the city's most valuable real estate. Chicago's population peaked at 3.62 million in 1950. It had been the second largest city in America for decades, behind only New York. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black Americans from the rural South to the factories and stockyards of the South and West sides. The Black Belt, as the narrow strip of the South Side where black residents were permitted to live was called, was one of the most densely populated and rigidly segregated neighborhoods in the country. The restrictive covenants that kept black families out of white neighborhoods were enforced by real estate agents, banks, and, when those failed, by mobs. The Chicago race riot of 1919, which lasted 13 days and killed 38 people, began when a black teenager named Eugene Williams drifted across an informal line separating the white and black sections of a Lake Michigan beach and was struck by a stone thrown by a white man. Williams drowned. The police refused to arrest anyone. The violence that followed spread across the South Side. Homes were burned. People were pulled from streetcars and beaten. The National Guard was called in. The riot was not an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a system of racial containment that compressed 300,000 people into a neighborhood designed for 50,000 and then blamed them for the conditions. The second half of the 20th century was a story of departure, and the departure followed the expressways out of the city like water following a pipe. The Congress Expressway, the Dan Ryan, the Kennedy, the Eisenhower, these roads were designed to move suburban commuters into the loop and back. But they also made it possible for the white middle class to work in the city and live outside it, taking their property taxes, their school enrollments, and their consumer spending with them. The Dan Ryan Expressway, completed in 1962, was the widest in the world at the time. 14 lanes of concrete that separated the white South Side neighborhoods from the black ones as effectively as any wall. The route was not an accident. It was chosen in part to reinforce the racial boundary that already existed along State Street, turning a de facto line into a concrete barrier. The factories closed. The stockyards shut down in 1971, ending more than a century of continuous operation. At their peak, the yards had employed over 40,000 workers and processed animals from ranches as far away as Montana and Texas. The smell of the stockyards, a thick, organic, inescapable stench of blood and offal and rendered fat, had been Chicago's defining sensory experience for generations. Residents on the South Side could tell the wind direction by whether they could smell the yards. When the yards closed, the smell disappeared, and with it the economic foundation of an entire cluster of neighborhoods. The steel mills on the South Side went silent. The white population fled to the suburbs in a migration so rapid and so racially motivated that it redrew the social geography of the entire metropolitan area within a single generation. The city's population dropped from 3.62 million in 1950 to 2.7 million in 2000. The neighborhoods that had been built by the meatpacking and steel industries, the brick bungalow belts of the South and West Sides, lost their economic reason to exist. On the West Side, blocks that had been home to Polish and Czech families for decades emptied out as the factories closed and the families moved to Cicero, Berwyn, and the western suburbs. The houses stayed. The people did not. On the South Side, the Robert Taylor Homes, a public housing project that stretched for 2 miles along the Dan Ryan Expressway, became a symbol of everything that public housing was not supposed to be. 28 identical 16-story towers 4,321 apartments, originally designed for 11,000 residents, held at peak occupancy an estimated 27,000 people. The elevators were broken. The stairwells were dark. The hallways smelled of urine. The gangways between buildings were controlled by gangs. The Robert Taylor homes were demolished between 1998 and 2007, and their residents were scattered across the city and the suburbs with vouchers that were, for many families, inadequate to secure housing in neighborhoods that did not want them. The Cabrini-Green public housing complex on the near north side underwent a similar trajectory. Built in stages between 1942 and 1962, Cabrini-Green was originally a mixed-income development that housed working families who had jobs in the nearby factories and stores. As the factories closed and the middle-class families left, the complex became increasingly isolated, underfunded, and dangerous. The high-rises, which had been designed with open-air galleries that were supposed to function as communal porches, became corridors that no one wanted to walk through after dark. Snipers fired from upper-floor windows at people in the courtyard below. A 7-year-old boy named Dantrell Davis was shot and killed by a sniper while walking to school in 1992, an event that shocked the city and accelerated the demolition timeline. The towers were taken down between 1995 and 2011. The land, which sits in one of the most valuable locations in Chicago, within walking distance of the Gold Coast and the lakefront, has been redeveloped into a mixed-income community of townhomes, condominiums, and rental apartments. The former residents of Cabrini-Green were promised the right to return. Most did not. The neighborhood that replaced the towers is quiet, landscaped, and unrecognizable. It is also overwhelmingly wealthier and whiter than the community it replaced. The displacement was not called displacement. It was called revitalization. The Chicago public school system, which had been one of the largest and most troubled in America, became a national experiment in education reform under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who served from 2011 to 2019. Emanuel closed 50 schools in 2013, the largest mass school closing in American history, affecting roughly 12,000 students, almost all of them black. The closings were justified on the basis of declining enrollment and fiscal necessity. The affected communities, which had already lost their factories, their housing projects, and their commercial corridors, now lost their schools, the last remaining institutional anchors that held neighborhoods together. Parents walked their children to new schools through gang territories they had spent their entire lives learning to avoid. The violence statistics that year confirmed what everyone had feared. Chicago today has a population of roughly 2.66 million, roughly 73% of its 1950 peak. The skyline is the most beautiful in America, a collection of buildings that trace their lineage directly to the architects who rebuilt the city after the fire. The Willis Tower, formerly the Sears Tower, completed in 1973, was the tallest building in the world for 25 years. Millennium Park, which opened in 2004 on the site of a former railroad yard, features a sculpture by Anish Kapoor called Cloud Gate, a 110-ton polished steel beam that reflects the skyline in its curved surface. Tourists take photographs of themselves in the reflection. The park cost $475 million, 4 times its original budget. It is, by most accounts, worth every penny. The restaurants are extraordinary. The pizza, both deep dish and tavern style, is a subject of civic devotion that approaches the intensity of religion. The blues clubs on the South Side, where the electric blues was invented in the 1940s and 1950s by Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf and Buddy Guy, still draw audiences who understand that Chicago's music, like Chicago's architecture, was forged in the aftermath of catastrophe. The political machine that governed Chicago through most of the 20th century was both the engine of the city's functioning and the mechanism of its inequality. Richard J. Daley, who served as mayor from 1955 to 1976, the longest tenure in the city's history, ran Chicago like a private corporation, dispensing jobs, contracts, and favors through a network of ward bosses and precinct captains that reached into every neighborhood. The machine built the expressways, the airports, the public housing towers. It also enforced the racial boundaries that kept the South and West sides segregated long after the Supreme Court had struck down restrictive covenants. When Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago in 1966 to lead an open housing campaign, marching through all-white neighborhoods on the Southwest side, he was met with a hostility so violent that he later said he had never seen anything like it, not in Alabama, not in Mississippi. Bricks and bottles rained down on the marchers. King was struck in the head by a rock thrown by a white teenager. The Chicago campaign is often considered King's only failure, but it exposed the depth of Northern segregation in a way that the Southern campaigns, with their clearer moral lines, had not. Daley's son, Richard M. Daley, served as mayor from 1989 to 2011 and presided over a transformation that turned the Loop and the lakefront into a showcase, while the South and West sides continued to deteriorate. The senior Daley's machine had been a blunt instrument of ethnic patronage. The younger Daley's governance was a sleeker operation that favored development, tourism, and the attraction of young professionals to the neighborhoods surrounding the Loop. Navy Pier was renovated. Millennium Park was built. The downtown Riverwalk was developed. The neighborhoods that benefited were the neighborhoods that were already proximate to wealth and transportation. The neighborhoods that did not benefit were the ones that had been left behind since the factories closed. But the two Chicagos that the fire created, the prosperous North and the struggling South and West, are still two Chicagos. The Loop and the North Side are thriving. The South and West sides are not. The life expectancy gap between the wealthiest and poorest neighborhoods in the city is 30 years. Englewood on the South Side has a life expectancy of 60. Streeterville on the near North Side has a life expectancy of 90. They are 8 miles apart. The violence that dominates national coverage of Chicago is concentrated in a small number of neighborhoods on the South and West sides, neighborhoods that have been systematically disinvested for decades, where the factories closed, the jobs left, the schools were shuttered, and the city that rose from the ashes of the Great Fire never quite reached. The fire did not destroy Chicago. The fire gave Chicago permission to become something that no American city had ever been before, a laboratory for the built environment, a place where the question was never, can we build this, but how tall can we build it? The barn at 137 DeKoven Street is gone. The entire neighborhood is gone. The site is now occupied by the Chicago Fire Department's training academy, which sits on the exact spot where the fire started, a coincidence that is either poetic or bureaucratic, depending on your temperament. The academy's address is 558 West DeKoven Street. There is a small sculpture marking the spot, a bronze relief depicting the fire installed in 1961. It does not mention Mrs. O'Leary. It does not mention the cow. It says only that the fire began here and that from the ashes rose a city that changed the world. The sculpture is easy to miss. Most Chicagoans have never seen it. They are too busy looking up.